So just normal, click to the next one.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, no, could just go.
There you go.
Yes. Six.
It's looking good though. Right, good morning and welcome, gentlemen, and I hand the floor over to you, and look forward to a presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Councillors, morning. We're presenting this morning for our results to the half year to the 31st of March, and just reminding you that we're also reporting to HBRC for our results to the 12 months to March because of our various balance dates. So today we're looking here at the half-yearly results to March, but our special purpose accounts are coming forward to Council for tomorrow. The auditors we're meeting on Friday with the auditor for the special purpose accounts. So I just note that this is the fourth time that we've had the opportunity to brief Council since the last election, and it was my idea that with the CEO of the Council to have this meeting in open session. There may be some comments, questions that you ask that we may not be able to answer, but we'll do our best. And clearly, we want to talk about some of the issues that were raised by councillors earlier in the year, and Garth will talk to them. But we're happy to have a go at answering the questions from councillors on any of the matters that we're discussing. So thanks for the opportunity.
Good morning. It's my privilege, obviously, in presenting the 6 monthly results to Council as a key stakeholder of the company. We've already made, as Jim's alluded to, this presentation, or one very, very similar to HBRC's board as the shareholder, but this is as a key stakeholder. In terms of the trade for the period, our container volumes were around 16% ahead of the same period last year. On a rolling 12-month basis, we're currently around just over 8% ahead of where we were, and that's around sitting at 222,000 TEUs, or 20-foot equivalent units in terms of the port's technical jargon. Our total volumes, though, rose as well, and we did see a new record set in March of 31,922 TEUs, or some 25% higher than March the year earlier. So all in all, in terms of a trade position, extremely positive. Non-containerised volumes also grew 13% during the period, and log volumes alone for that period relative to the year earlier were 37% higher. So ship calls were only marginally higher at 325, but that growth is being driven overall by dairy, timber, apples, pulp, also meat. There's some other ones there that also have underpinned that growth. So it would be, it's not over all commodities. In particular, some of them are struggling relative to the New Zealand dollar, but a number aren't. I've produced this graph on a number of occasions just to show the seasonality of our business and what impact that does have in terms of how we position ourselves and the type of infrastructure that we actually try and cater for. And obviously, even as we've grown the off-season business, our peak has continued to grow pretty much at the same rate. So in that sense, it does present some challenges for us. In terms of the financials, our net profit after tax increased 51% for the 6-month period, year on year. Our revenues grew 16% and currently sit at just over 35 million for the 6 months. Our EBITDA, that's earnings before interest, depreciation and amortisations, actually increased 32%, which really reflects the fact that we're predominantly a fixed cost business, and so we're able to drive some of that extra volume growth into our bottom line. And our expenditure increased around 6% for the period, year on year. So in that sense, a very pleasing financial result. But in saying that, obviously we did incur a number of issues, and we did have severe space constraints on port, particularly during March. That resulted in congestion issues that impacted on truck turnaround, plant and labour limitations, berth productivity, and just significant efficiency issues in terms of how we could drive our business, and that did actually add additional cost through that period. Our container berth utilisation in the peak season in March actually was over 80%, including the times of moving vessels on and off the berth. And to give you an understanding of just how we've increased our staff in the last 12-month period, from 31 March last year to this year, our total staff complement grew from 184 to 213. And that's resulted in wider engagement in a number of areas, permanent casuals, fixed term and full-time staff across the board. And so the result that we've seen, particularly in the financial area, but also just dealing with some of the issues that we've identified, did result in a lot of goodwill and commitment from our staff to get that result. So a very pleasing outcome overall.
Can you just talk about the 80% relative to other performance? I mean,
in terms of
very high utilisation.
Yes, in terms of a single berth utilisation factor, generally when it's getting over 50%, and these are generic sort of numbers internationally with ports, and once it gets to about 55% utilisation, generally they're identifying a need for a new berth. But bear in mind that we only hit this for 1 or 2 months, 1 month of our year. So that has to be balanced off with the all year round averages that are used in some of these international comparisons. But basically, if all year round, if it's getting over 55% a single berth, it's time to start looking seriously at a new berth. In terms of just talking about some of the congestion issues, and I appreciate some of the council have already been involved in discussions with the port earlier to get an understanding of these. They boiled down to some key areas. One was our inability to control or manage the truck arrivals at our entrance gate. It also related to our inability to free up space, as we have been able to do in the past on port. And the number of empty containers delivered in March this year was 51% higher than March last year. We also saw the Japanese government impose a new reporting standard on shipping lines, and by default that flowed through to the port, which effectively meant that we added 3 days dwell time to most of our container activities to Japan, North Asia. And that effectively, their biggest services effectively are Tuesday, Wednesday to Japan or North Asia, and that meant obviously we would need to receive those containers now on a Friday rather than a Monday. So that was part of that extra dwell time. Also, obviously, we had competing container depots also being maxed out, and as a result of that, we saw over 900 of their units, containers, being held on port for them, which limited our ability to have space. And just as a guide, basically March saw a 400% increase in our empty storage days on port. So it was a huge impact right across the board. Obviously we had 2 new seasonal services that also added by them bringing in extra containers as well. And I make a comment there around port marks, because again the number of ports that these services go to, if they're all going to Palapas, that's fine because it's one port mark. But when you're going to multiple port marks, all those ports and containers need to be kept separate in terms of the way you load the vessels to a large degree. And also we did impact, or have impacted on us, the vessel sequencing from other ports in that time. So where do we think we're going to be, and what are some of the issues that we're currently seeing in the container area? We're currently predicting a pretty flat second half of the year. If we're currently trading at around 222, we're only seeing a small uplift for the balance of the year, and we're now predicting something in the order of 226,000 containers for the full year. And that's been impacted by those empties coming in early and the earlier apple crop, all having an impact. So we're actually seeing, or predicting a pretty flat period. Centreport's also actively promoting their rail initiative, and they're currently subsidising inland freight movements from New Plymouth and Palmerston North. They've offered subsidised freight out of Napier, but no one's taken that up yet. I think most of the locals would want to live. So it's an interesting initiative, and that which we'll be responding to, or are responding to currently. We're also obviously targeting out of region volume, but it is at significantly lower margin, and it is extremely competitive, very competitive. We're also assessing the viability of more dedicated freight hubs, and we currently bring volume from Wanganui and from Palmerston North and Woodville, and we've had trials from different areas like Martin and the northern Wairarapa. So all those, and certainly Palmerston North becomes a key part of that that area.
Just while you're on that point, Garth, it's interesting the effect that rail has had on our volumes with this out of region cargo, because remember that the bulk of the dairy product comes over from Taranaki, from Hawera. The night train that's coming in every night now, or six days a week, five nights a week, six nights a week, is from Kariori, just south of Waiouru. So a lot of this extra volume that we are dealing with out of region is in conjunction with Kiwi Rail and coming in, as I said, from the Kariori one, nightly train coming in. So there's a much greater relationship with Kiwi Rail, with logs coming in from Wanganui, Masterton, Martin. So that's part of our increase in volume.
Just ask a quick question, Bob. What would be the increase in containers that are being carried by Kiwi Rail just in the recent period?
Most probably 3 or 4 years ago, we were doing less than 10% of our container volumes would be on rail. Now it's most probably closer to 25% as a without checking the absolute numbers, but that's a
good. So it's a significant shift.
Yes. Yep.
That's very good.
There's an interesting statistic, that is that in the National Freight Task, road transport volumes are flat, but rail's picked up, increased by 12% last year or so.
I think that's we're seeing that now, even with Kiwi Rail's initiatives in terms of moving logs as well. We've been able to develop a model that seems to work, and certainly we're looking at, and again it's a little difficult to comment specifics, but we do have very specific proposals with Kiwi Rail that will eventuate hopefully in October, which will see significantly increased log capacity coming to Napier. So yeah, we're working across that whole area with Kiwi Rail, and it seems to be working very, very well, and they're responding to the market and the commercial drivers as well. Obviously we're working aggressively to hold the gains that we've made in the first half year. There's still, though, significant pressure from international shipping lines on current pricing and future pricing, and obviously the performance-related issues that go with that. And previously we've most probably seen a progressive cascading of vessels, nothing like the size that is currently talked about in the media, which appears to be a little bit of an overhype, but the size has generally moved up in terms of the New Zealand averages. And that's likely to continue. And it's one of the other interesting things is that there is still an oversupply of very large vessels coming into the international market, which means there will be a cascading effect of then larger vessels into other trades, and how far down they trickle or cascade certainly we're expecting there will be some effect into the New Zealand market in the longer term. But whether they're of the 6,000 or 7,000 scale that have been talked about is most probably somewhat doubtful in the short term. But certainly ratcheting up from the sort of average at the moment, it's most probably around 2,600 or 2,800 TEU size vessels, moving to 3.5, and then most probably to the 4,500 sized vessel. And that vessel is a size that we currently handle now in terms of some of the trades that we've had. Yes.
Just on that, so how challenged are we in terms of size of ships and our capacity to manage that in relation to other ports in New Zealand?
In New Zealand, well, currently there's a number of components of that. Draft is one, length overall, and width. In terms of draft, our current dredging program will see us move our maximum draft out to around 12.4, 12.5 metres, which is the depth that most of the current ports, Auckland, Tauranga, they're slightly deeper at times, but in the general, that's more than sufficient for vessels currently servicing New Zealand. Longer term, will it be the required depth? Most probably it will be for a port like Napier, because again we're a mid-port. We don't have to be the deepest draft for a vessel arriving with full imports, and equally we're not the last port going out like Tauranga, which needs to have deeper draft because we're a mid-port. So they're always taking off empties here and loading fulls as a consequence, so we don't need to have the maximum draft that some of the other ports have. But in a New Zealand context, Wellington's only 11.5 or something. So certainly Port Chalmers is around that 12.5 metres. Littleton's I think about the same, 13 metres. So that gets us into that sort of ballpark as a mid-port. In terms of length, we've currently handled vessels over 300 metres for cruise, and they've been backed into the port, but that's because they are more manoeuvrable. Backing in a 300 metre container vessel is somewhat more challenging. Even though we have the tug capacity to do it, you've got to convince the shipping line that they feel comfortable about it and the master feel comfortable about it. Overall, though, we've turned vessels inside the port at 294 metres in length, and that's more than large enough to take the next, most probably two sizes up in terms of container vessels. The largest container vessel currently that we've handled is around 284 metres in length, and that's a 4,500 TEU or 4,900 TEU vessel. So the next stage though is width, and most of the vessels at the moment travelling through the port are 32.2 metres beam maximum, and that's to allow them to go through the Panama Canal previously. But those changes in the Panama due for 2015-16 will see their maximum width go from about 32.8 metres out to 55 metres, I think it is, in width. So all of a sudden there's a different dynamics, and different types of vessels are likely to call into New Zealand and Australia, particularly those that are going direct to Europe as opposed to going through a hub in Singapore or Hong Kong. So we don't think we'll get anything like that size or width of vessel in New Zealand, but we're seeing vessels currently on the Asian trade moving out to 37 metres of beam, and we're servicing those with our current new cranes. But we certainly see them going out to 40 metres progressively over time, and that sits with a vessel of that 6,000 or 7,000 TEU size range. Now, if you get that extra width, you don't get the length, so it's a combination. We see vessels most probably in that 40 metre beam and round the 270, 280 metre being capable of handling 6,500 TEUs in the longer term. So it's a complicated position, but we think we've got the dynamics for the foreseeable future. Yes. Yep.
Question just on that. It's really interesting that something that happens in the Panama can influence us here, and I'm glad you're onto those sort of dynamics. But what happens if the shipping companies, and is it likely that the shipping companies could collectivise and say that they only want 2 ports in a little country like New Zealand? And if that was is that like what's the threat to us, and how are we managing that threat? I just mean, are we competitive in that threat? So if they did that, would it rather we'd knock out some other port and we would stay?
2 ports in New Zealand is certainly a prospect. One North Island, one South Island. And to be realistic, in the North Island, if the shipping line decided to do that, it's not going to be Napier. I think we need to be realists about that. It'll be Tauranga or Auckland in that sense, but either one of those other large ports will miss out. I think, though, what isn't taken into account, and certainly in the media commentary, the competitive responses from the other shipping lines. How are they going to respond to a port wanting to hub everything, let's say to Auckland or to Tauranga, and either of those have that prospect. And I think there's enough international shipping lines that would look at other competitive options and call direct, absolutely. So, and quite often when you hub, it forces exporters out of this region to pay the extra shipping cost to move it to that hub port. Often the international line won't wear that cost. So all of a sudden then the exporters in this region need to look at how they work collectively to drive other competitive options. And that's where we would work with the local industry and other shipping lines in particular to try and make sure we had other options on the table for them to ship out locally. So, or alternatively, you end up being a feeder to that hub port, so it would still go across Napier, but it's part of that then international linkage to Tauranga or Auckland.